Master Vampire Karen Youth surveyed the assembled vampires with an expression of cold indifference. Once, many of them had regarded him with disdain, mocking him for his half-breed status, sneering at his very existence as something lesser. But now, they were his. Every single one of them bent to his will, their arrogant smirks replaced with silent, obedient reverence. Of course, his rise to dominance had not been without resistance. Some had struggled, had fought tooth and claw against his control, but their efforts had proven futile. Those strong enough to defy him had been swiftly and ruthlessly eliminated by those too weak to resist his command. "Are we done?" Karen's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Nearly, sire," came the reply from Count Hesse, his voice carefully measured. Hesse's eyes remained fixed on the blood dripping steadily from Karen's open wrist, his gaze betraying both reverence and hunger. The liquid collected in a goblet, each crimson drop a step closer to completing the transference ritual, the key to his ever-growing power. A jagged metal spike protruded from his flesh, preventing the wound from sealing, grinding against his bone with every minor shift of his posture. The discomfort was considerable, but what was pain in the face of absolute dominion? Over half of the thralls now belonged to him, bound to his will, their thoughts an extension of his own. It was a dream made manifest, a nation of beings who would follow his every command without hesitation, without question. If he so desired, he could wipe the remaining vampires from existence, leaving behind only his enthralled subjects, molded to serve him as he saw fit. A kingdom of perfect obedience. A tempting thought. But reality was rarely so simple. A nation could not thrive when its only mind was his own. They would struggle to advance, to grow. And without independent thinkers, maintaining diplomatic relations with the outside world would prove difficult. He would always be watching his neighbors, constantly anticipating betrayal. No, it was wiser to let some of the free-willed vampires remain, to govern, to advise, to act as necessary evils in a larger game. Still, he would have to choose carefully. Only the most useful would be allowed to live. His foot pressed down, driving his heel into the newest addition to his footrest, Count Alora's Toino. The noble tensed beneath the pressure but dared not make a sound. Karen could feel the flicker of defiance still burning inside him, but he smothered it with a thought, reveling in the power to deny him even the ability to voice his pain. As he basked in his triumph, a sudden, faint scent drifted into his nostrils. Familiar. Unpleasant. A stench that sent an involuntary shudder through his frame. His nostrils flared as he took another breath, trying to place it. It was fleeting, already fading, but something about it gnawed at his thoughts. A scent from his past. But when, where, had he last smelled this? His sharp gaze flickered across the room, scrutinizing the gathered vampires. Did someone pass gas? His words echoed through the chamber, laced with subtle compulsion, but none stepped forward. He inhaled again. Nothing. His annoyance deepened, but before he could pursue the matter further, the flap of the tent was abruptly pulled aside. A younger vampire stepped in, bowing deeply before speaking. "Your Highness, I bring news from the front." "Speak." "The Wilder have begun employing shield formations, and their use of spears is wreaking havoc on our forces. Our casualties are rising at an alarming rate." Hesse chose that moment to interject, lifting the goblet with great care. "The goblet is full, sire." Karen barely acknowledged him. His mind was already racing. "Shield formations, you say?" He removed the stake from his wrist, wincing as his flesh finally began to knit itself back together. "It seems our forces require a more experienced commander." His voice carried the weight of command as he turned his gaze toward Duke Missile. "Gather the thralls under your command. Take them to the front lines. Your orders are simple, bring me every Wilder you can capture." Missile hesitated. Karen could feel the noble struggling against the invisible chains that bound him, the last vestiges of his free will clawing against an inevitable fate. "Why yes, sire," he stammered at last. As Missile turned to leave, Hesse passed the goblet to an assistant, and together, they followed the messenger out of the tent. Kieran flexed his fingers, watching the last remnants of his wound heal slower than usual. He would have to feed soon. There must be a more efficient way, he muttered, annoyed. I'm afraid not, my lord, HFY replied with a deferential bow. The transference is over halfway complete, it won't be much longer. Kieran sighed, tapping his fingers idly on the armrest of his throne. HFY, unlike many of the others, had not required direct domination to serve. He simply recognized Kieran's superiority and adapted accordingly. That made him useful. The same could not be said for Duke Missile. The Duke fought against Kieran's control with every fiber of his being. If Kieran hadn't undone the self-modifications the vampire had made to his own body, he would have broken free by now. As it stood, one wrong move could see him regain his autonomy. That would not be tolerated. He would have to either dispose of him permanently or keep him so weak that escape was impossible. The latter would be deeply satisfying, but the former was the wiser option. His gaze drifted across the assembled nobles, analyzing each of them in turn. Half of them were fighting his influence. Should he simply purge the dissenters? The idea had merit. He had been wronged by many of them. A single order, and they would willingly step onto a burning pyre. It would be effortless. But if he wiped out too many of them, the vampire population would dwindle too far. Their grip on the Night Kingdom was already tenuous. If he thinned their numbers any further, they would struggle to hold dominion over a duchy, much less an empire. Convincing them to accept his rule, rather than forcing it, might be the better choice. But doing so meant dodging assassination attempts for the rest of his reign. Kieran exhaled sharply. The burdens of leadership. Of course, this all depended on whether he could reclaim the Night Kingdom in the first place. Lord Len's forces had been shattered, but his fate remained uncertain. If the orcs executed him, they would either install a puppet ruler or seize the kingdom outright. Kieran almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. The elite vampire aristocracy bowing to Orcish tribal rule? The thought was almost poetic. But if the orcs claimed the Night Kingdom, it might actually make Kieran's conquest easier. A puppet regime could be toppled, negotiated with, or converted. A sudden, sharp pang in his senses ripped him from his thoughts. That scent. Again. It hit him full force, a revolting concoction of rotting meat, molten metal, and blood. Copper, iron, salt. A dungeon stench. His eyes widened as the realization struck like a lightning bolt. The dungeon. My lord? HFY blinked in confusion. Kieran's mind whirled in panic. How could he be here? Memories of a past battle flashed before his eyes, the monstrous thing that had nearly ended him. The unnatural hunger in its eyes. He shot to his feet and stormed out of the tent. His heart, a thing long dormant, pounded in his chest. And then, an elf-like figure leapt from the shadows. With inhuman speed, it severed Duke Missile's head in a single strike. Kieran froze. A whisper escaped HFY's lips. Oh, my. The nobles shifted uneasily, their murmured concerns filling the air. It'll be a fight on two fronts, one of them pointed out, his voice laced with apprehension. No, Kieran Youth corrected coldly, his piercing gaze sweeping over the gathered aristocrats. The Wilder will not venture beyond their forests. Not even to rescue those we've captured. They are bound to their ancient lands, too superstitious to leave them behind. Once we march from this place, our focus will shift entirely to the orcs. The noble who had spoken, an insufferable fool, opened his mouth to argue, but Kieran tightened his hold on the man's mind, exerting his control far harder than before. The noble's eyes glazed over as his body stiffened, a thin stream of drool escaping from his slackened lips. The others flinched at the sight, exchanging silent glances of fear. We leave immediately, Kieran declared, his voice brooking no dissent. Every moment we delay, we risk losing more soldiers. Get your brood in line. Prepare to march. The nobles nodded in stiff unison, their wills subjugated once more. One by one, they filed out of the tent, their compliance absolute. Kieran remained behind, overseeing the servants as they worked to dismantle the encampment. Within 3 hours, everything was packed. 12,000 troops and prisoners, a mix of vampires, thralls, and other creatures bound to his cause, stood in formation, awaiting his command. Mounting his hammer, a beast of unnatural endurance, Kieran gave the signal to move. They advanced southeast, the Wilder launching small-scale offensives in a last-ditch effort to harass them. But their attacks were weak, pitiful attempts to disrupt a force they no longer had the strength to challenge. Kieran's soldiers cut them down with minimal effort, and before nightfall, they had left the forest's oppressive grip behind. As the open plains stretched before them, the journey turned dull. That was when HFY came sprinting from the left flank, his face contorted in urgency. "Sire," he shouted, struggling to keep pace with Kieran's hammer. Kieran tilted his head slightly, but his expression remained unreadable. "There are some things that want to meet with you," HFY panted. "Things?" Kieran narrowed his eyes. "Be more specific." A voice, smooth, almost playful, answered in HFY's place. "You know us as demons, Master Vampire Kieran Youth, former Master General of the Night Kingdom." Kieran's eyes flicked beyond HFY, where two figures had seemingly materialized from the shadows. They bore the appearance of elves, but their scent betrayed them. Demons. The smaller of the two had spoken, his expression sly and knowing. The larger figure remained eerily silent, his presence looming like an unspoken threat. Kieran did not react immediately. Instead, he studied them, his mind rapidly assessing the situation. "An odd development," he remarked at last, his voice smooth yet wary. "Your kind are not exactly welcome on this plane. What interest do demons have in vampires?" The smaller demon grinned. "We have been watching, of course," he said, his tone laced with amusement. "We could not help but notice your struggles. You are in dire straits, Master Vampire." Kieran's gaze darkened. "Speak plainly, demon. I tire of riddles." The demon chuckled. "Tell me, if your current plans fail, what then? Will you abandon all hope of reclaiming the Night Kingdom? Or will you desperately claw at some new, far-fetched scheme?" A flash of irritation crossed Kieran's features. "I do not appreciate your tone, invader," he said coldly. "I will ask once more, what business is it of yours?" "Introductions first," the demon said, his smile widening. "I am Theus the Ulator, and this is Hergus the Decimator." Hergus gave no reaction, his presence remaining as still and implacable as ever. Theus continued, his voice as light as if they were discussing mere politics. "We would like to offer you our aid." Kieran laughed, a sharp, derisive sound. "A deal with demons?" "No," Theus corrected, his grin never faltering. ****, a deal with the hells." Kieran's laughter stopped abruptly. That was different. Now, he was intrigued. He arched an eyebrow. "And why, exactly, would the hells offer to aid us?" Theus's expression turned almost conspiratorial. "We plan to invade this plane again in the near future," he said, as if discussing a minor military campaign. "If you and your army join our invasion, we will grant you the Night Kingdom as your reward." Kieran's mind raced. A demon army would be far more likely to succeed than negotiations with the unified chiefs. His current plan was ambitious, but also fraught with uncertainty. Theus had been spot on in calling it far-fetched. Did the demon already know the full extent of his strategy? Or was he simply making assumptions? "And what of our current plans?" Kieran asked, masking his thoughts. "Abandon them," Theus said with a dismissive wave. "Your odds of success are much higher with us than with whatever desperate scheme you are concocting with the unified chiefs." Kieran's fingers tensed. An assumption, then. Good. That meant no spies had infiltrated his ranks. "Will our independence be assured?" Kieran pressed. "Or will we be expected to bend the knee?" Theus smirked. "The Night Kingdom will remain untouched by demonic influence, for as long as you rule. Of course, you will have to comply with some demands, but the finer details can be arranged with my masters." And how do I meet these masters? Kieran asked. You and your army will accompany me to the Hells, Theus said smoothly. You will be safe during and after the negotiations. If you decline, you will be returned exactly to this place and time, unchanged. If you accept, you will be housed and fed until the invasion begins. The offer was tempting. Too tempting. Demons were liars. Masters of deception. But if Kieran refused, he would eventually have to fight them anyway, and if that happened, his forces would be severely weakened by their current battles. He could either cling to his original plan and hope for the best, or take a calculated risk. He exhaled slowly. Fine, he said at last. I will meet with your masters. Theus grinned victoriously. Excellent. A sudden pull gripped Kieran's very being, an overwhelming force dragging him away from the mortal plane. Then, darkness. When the world came back into focus, Kieran found himself struggling to keep his stomach from revolting. The air was thick with sulfur, the ground beneath him hot and cracked. And waiting for him, seated on a throne of smoldering obsidian, was a being of immense power, one whose very presence threatened to crush him under its weight. The master of the Hells had been expecting him. Welcome, Kieran youth, the voice rumbled. Let us discuss your future. Algian's voice carried the weight of revelation, his tone almost amused. We move you faster by passing through our home plane, he explained, his lips curling into a knowing smirk. Mule de Bram let out a chuckle, his amusement evident. So, I began, my mind trying to piece together the bizarre logic. Because Tits and Ver don't understand how stomachs work, they weren't able to fully conceptualize them? Not quite, Algian corrected. The problem wasn't the stomach itself, it was the food inside. They couldn't conceptualize how the food and stomach were interacting. Tits gave a sheepish shrug. Yeah. I kinda just took a wild guess, the flirty archfey admitted. So, wait, Nash interjected. The food in our stomachs was the problem? What happened? Did it turn from a liquid to a solid or something? Algian hesitated. I'm not entirely certain, but trust me, there are far worse things that can happen to actualized objects in the fair realm. It seems we were. He paused, choosing his words carefully, fortunate. His voice held a strange undertone of unease. A rare admission of concern from someone like Algian. My apologies, he continued. It simply didn't occur to me earlier. Tits took a step closer, leaning toward me. His lips were inches from my ear, his breath warm against my skin. Looks like you should definitely forget about what I mentioned earlier, he whispered, his voice dripping with playful mischief. I barely suppressed a shudder. Yeah, I muttered back under my breath. For a moment, silence settled over us. Everyone seemed deep in thought, contemplating the strange and unsettling mechanics of the fair realm. Then, Mule de Bram suddenly stretched, letting out a loud sigh, as if physically breaking the tension in the air. So, he said, his voice casual yet deliberate, what are the vampires up to? Algian's expression darkened slightly. Once the thralls stopped moving, he reported, the brood broke under the strain of our attacks. Their leaders called for a full retreat. We pursued them for a time, striking at their flanks, but they're nearly out of the forest now. They're heading toward the orcs, then? Yes. Mule de Bram nodded slowly, considering the implications. All right, he said at last. I'll send word to let them know. Then, his gaze swept over me, Nash, and Yulk. It would appear, he continued, that you three have fulfilled your purpose admirably. In fact, he smirked. So admirably, that you've earned your reward. Reward? I repeated, my brow furrowing. Was that the deal they had made? Indeed, de Bram confirmed. I offered them a reward for their assistance. He gestured to Nash and Yulk. Your reward, he said, his grin widening, is the reaffirmation of our friendship. I blinked. That's it? It's a better reward than it sounds, I promise, de Bram assured me. Meanwhile, Nash, who had clearly secured a different deal, flashed me a smug grin. I rolled my eyes. All right, I sighed. And what about them? They fought on the front lines, so now it's my turn to uphold my end of the bargain, Debron said smoothly. He turned back toward me. I agreed, he continued, to do everything in my power to help you get home. A flicker of hope stirred in my chest. But before I could speak, he raised a hand. The task itself, he admitted, is beyond my capabilities. My hope dimmed. But, he added, his voice taking on a playful edge, my power extends beyond magic and physicality, so I've done something a little silly. His smirk returned. I contacted the Court of the Wild on your behalf. A beat of silence followed. Algian's eyes widened in shock. Tits let out a sharp gasp. I looked between them, waiting for an explanation. Even Nash seemed confused. Yulk, on the other hand, looked like he was barely containing his excitement. You didn't, Algian murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Debron's grin widened. I did. Algian's expression turned grim. You have no sway with the Court of the Wild, he warned. No, Debron agreed, but they owe me favors, ones that are eons old. And while they may not favor me, I have the authority to pass a favor along to them. Even though it is an utterly ridiculous, moral custom, it technically falls within my power. I frowned. So what does that mean, exactly? It means, Debron explained, that you will appear before the court and explain your plight. They will, of course, have many inane questions and snide remarks, but if they possess knowledge that can aid you, they will share it. With a catch, I guessed. Of course, he said. If the knowledge is sufficiently sensitive, they may demand something in return, a quest, perhaps. Yulk, who had been barely restraining himself, burst out. When do we leave? Debron chuckled. Well, he said, summer is nearly over. The court does not convene in autumn or spring, so you'll have to wait until next summer. Next summer? I repeated, feeling my stomach sink. Wait, Nash interjected. If the court doesn't meet in spring or fall, what about winter? Absolutely not, Debron laughed. The summer court is, well, not exactly friendly toward mortals, he admitted. But the winter court? His expression turned dark. The winter court is utterly, irrevocably hostile to your kind, he warned. Even if I held any sway with them, which I do not, your torture and death would be all but guaranteed. I swallowed hard. So when you say Court of the Wild, there are actually two of them? Nash asked. In a way, Debron admitted. It is a single entity with two faces. He sighed, pulling out another cigarette. The queens of the court believe that a being known as Mother Earth gave birth to this plane, he explained. The higher ones insist that is nothing more than a myth. But belief is different for the wilder. How so? I asked. For them, belief is tangible. He took a drag, exhaling a plume of smoke. Summer is the season of life, he continued, and winter is the season of death. Because of this, the queens undergo a metamorphosis with each passing season. The implications sent a chill down my spine. Debron's gaze met mine. This, he said, is the truth of the court. And if you wish to seek their guidance, you must be prepared for the consequences. For the first time, I hesitated. And for the first time, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake.